This webinar is presented by Status Solutions. Now let's get started and meet your two speakers for today. Brad Spicer is founder and president of Safe Plans. His expertise as a safety and security consultant includes police instruction, dignitary protection, homeland security, school safety, and emergency planning and response with advanced threat assessment training from the U.S. Secret Service and Gavin DeBecker and Associates. With a degree in criminal justice, Spicer began his career in the U.S. Army as an intelligence analyst and later served as a squad leader in Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. He then spent 11 years with the Missouri State Highway Patrol, serving 5 years each on the Special Emergency Response Team and the Governor's Security Division. Our next speaker, our second speaker today, will be Amy Jess. She has more than 18 years of experience in the technology industry and now serves as a technology and marketing consultant for Status Solutions. Before joining Status in 2006, Amy's business-to-business career included 10 years with enterprise software and IT services companies, where she helped to develop new solutions, bring them to market, and train customers to use them with the desired ROI. Amy is a cum laude graduate of Auburn University with a bachelor's degree in mass communications. Now, before we get started, we would like to present a poll question to you all to get a sense of where you are with your emergency preparedness plans. So a poll question will pop up in a moment for you to cast your vote, and that is, how ready do you rate your facility in terms of emergency preparedness today? So please take a moment to cast your vote there. The selections are not adequately prepared, somewhat prepared, prepared in terms of meeting state and federal obligations, prepared in terms of stakeholders knowing their roles, or extremely prepared, including holding regular drills. So if you please just take a few seconds to cast your vote. We will show the results right now. Okay, so the leader there at about a third is somewhat prepared. After that, prepared in terms of meeting state and federal obligations. Okay, all right, good. And then 18, 17, and 9%. So thank you very much for that. So without further ado, I will hand the presentation over to Brad. Brad?
Great, thank you. Look forward to getting going, providing some information about preparedness. You know, we're going to talk a lot about different aspects of preparedness today. Your facility needs an all-hazards emergency plan and strategy that goes beyond just the plan with security planning, technology solutions. Today, for examples, a lot of times we're going to use the scenario of an active shooter or violent intruder. It's not that that is the single most likely impact. It does impact any type of facility, and also we want to try to provide some hopefully takeaway information that will help with your preparedness. So we go on to the next slide. So why we plan and prepare. I talked about all hazards preparedness. You can see some somewhat recent events. You know, preparedness, as I mentioned, needs to be all hazards. We can see the active shooter scenario, chemical releases, public health emergencies is certainly a continued threat and a growing need, and something we see a lot of facilities are very deficient in planning for. You know, public health emergencies, obviously Ebola got a lot of headlines, you know, 3-4 months ago, but now we're seeing more emergence concerns with the bird flu, especially in the Midwest. You see the H1N1. So public health preparedness can impact not just life safety, but also business operations. So it shows that full element of emergency planning that's needed to look at business continuity. If you can't get into your facility or social distancing is needed and your business is dependent upon that, having plans to help prevent that is critical. Severe weather, tornado events coming up, certainly that season in the Midwest, and then hurricane season has not officially started, but in all practical terms has started for the Gulf and the Atlantic coast. So a lot of different ways that we need to prepare for. You can go on to the next slide. So a plan, you know, really is the playbook, if you will. I don't want to make light of emergencies and life or death situations and compare it to a game, but if you imagine a playbook, regardless of the sport, that emergency plan is your playbook. Your drills, your exercises, that's your practice. You know, it helps you perform better. So what we want to do is make sure that your emergency plan hits on some key areas. The bullets you see up are critical as far as outlining responsibility, expressing authority and relationships so that people understand what's expected of them. A big gap we see in a lot of emergency plans, previously we saw the BP spill, which, you know, when we look at the emergency plan that failed there, the plan was actually developed for a different location. When it was originally developed, it was probably an effective plan, but it had been copied over and reused, and it really wasn't relevant to the Gulf of Mexico and to that particular location. So we want to make sure that the plan is relevant to where it's at, and then expresses that authority so that that person that's in charge of that facility understands what their responsibilities are. Document protection of people and property. Obviously, life safety is the #1 priority. Look at your resources so that you can think ahead of time. Innovative thinking does not occur under emergency conditions. So when an emergency does occur, it's very difficult to think outside the box and start identifying your resources that are needed. So do that ahead of time, how to contact them, establish those relationships. And then also, important aspect, a lot of emergencies, mitigation can come into play. So we want to try to mitigate that whenever we can. Talked about all hazards. So once again, not that we think this is your greatest risk, but in this short webinar, we want to try to give you some solid takeaways, and we can't cover every possible scenario and how to develop a plan for that in a short period of time. But I think we can talk about the violent intruder or active shooter threat and discuss how recent best practices have emerged and how that might be applied to your facility. When we talk about these types of attacks, and really this goes with any emergency, you know, rather than when does an attack start, you can also look at when does an emergency start. For an attack, we look at an event, and a lot of times the media focuses on the response. Even the events that are going on in Philadelphia now with the train crash, we look at the post-crash incident, you know, but the elements that led up to the crash or could have prevented or mitigated it could be looked at before. So if we look to the right of the attack, that's a response. If we can look to the left on this timeline, those are human-based threats, pre-attack indicators. In general emergencies, it's prevention and mitigation opportunities. When we look at a human-based threat, we call these pre-attack indicators or pains. Those are opportunities to identify, you know, potentially dangerous behavior before it's too late. And go on to the next slide. So most people realize we have a much broader group than just K-12, but Columbine really brought active shooter to the forefront of our society. It was by no means the first active shooter or mass killing incident, but it's the one that really garnered the headlines and helped to coin the phrase active shooter. And it really challenged a lot of different things. The school setting, it challenged them to develop threat assessment programs for predictive behavior, to look for warning signs, because that really failed at Columbine. We'll talk about that in just a second. It also challenged law enforcement. You can see the two killers entered the school at 11:19 a.m. They did not commit suicide until 12:08. So a lot of time that it took law enforcement to get into the school gave them the opportunity. Prior to Columbine, law enforcement had a mentality and response of contain, communicate, and call SWAT. SWAT is a great tool, but it's not an effective tool for active shooter response. If law enforcement agencies, and not many are, still feel that's their response to an active shooter, and they put on community displays showing SWAT units that are highly trained and equipped going into an active shooter, they're missing the mark. Active shooter events are typically over in 5 minutes these days. Columbine went on longer because law enforcement allowed it to. So law enforcement's changed their tactics. Schools have somewhat changed their tactics on how they respond, going away from a lockdown-only strategy. When we look at Columbine, there were a lot of opportunities that were left of the attack, if you will, that could have prevented this. And so we can go to the next slide. So the attack started at 11:15 as when they started their first bomb attempt. Now the shooting started at 11:19 when they entered the school, but 11:15 they tried to get a bomb to go off, and at 12:08 is when the attack effectively ended. But you can look on this timeline to the left of the attack. In 1996 was the first indicator of potentially violent behavior with a violent blog online. You can see it progressed. In March of 1998, a parent actually reported to the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department concerning behavior about these students making threats, and they continue to progress. So when we look at active shooter response, we don't want to just look at how we're going to respond. Ideally, what we want to do is apply all elements of preparedness to the situation so we have full opportunity to prevent and mitigate. That mindset can be applied to any hazard. Even if you can't prevent severe weather, your ability to detect it early, your ability to reinforce your structure, act early to minimize people's exposure. This strategy of prevention can be applied in a lot of places. Next slide. This just a different graphic illustrating the Columbine timeline, where the attack is the tip of the iceberg, and all the other warning signs were underneath it. So, especially in human-based violence, people do not just snap. That behavior is observable, and it's as observable as water coming to a boil if you're in a position to observe it and if you know what to look for. So really want to look at your plans and your training and your strategies to make sure that you're getting that awareness factor out there. We don't want our active shooter, violent intruder response plans to stop at just response. We really want to look at prevention and mitigation so that it's prevention, so we have the opportunity to stop it from happening. Slide. So situational awareness is how that's the broader strategy to help us, recognize and identify these potentially violent behaviors or warning signs in any emergency. Situational awareness is something that we all have sometimes, but none of us have at all times, and it's a skill set that we can improve upon. It's the ability to identify and process and comprehend critical information about what's happening around us. But situational awareness, especially with human-based threats, requires two things. You have to understand your environment, and then you also have to understand what is dangerous or potentially dangerous behavior. Next slide. A way that has been developed to explain situational awareness, to kind of put it in a format that's a little easier to explain and understand, because there's different levels of situational awareness. No one is always at heightened security. When we're at the lowest level of awareness, that's white. And these color codes have nothing to do with the old Homeland Security color code. This has been around for many years. That was developed by a Marine named Jeff Cooper, who really explored not just combat, but the mentality behind it, how aware people are and how they're able to act. And what he determined was, what he associated with white is unprepared and ready to take action. Now, sometimes that's we're not paying attention, we're not doing our job. Time will tell with the investigation in Philadelphia if that's the case with the train operator. We just don't know at this point, but that's possible. Another element that explains white is when we're asleep. White has different levels, but in an emergency situation or for responsible for the safety of others, white is not helpful. What we want is yellow. Yellow is prepared, alert, relaxed, good situational awareness. Yellow is not overly paranoid. It's not hypervigilant. It's just aware of your environment. Once again, understanding your environment and what's dangerous. So yellow takes a little bit of training so we can help people understand what is dangerous. If something changes from our baseline, so we understand our environment and we understand what normal operations are, our desired daily function is going on, something changes from that baseline, not for the better, that should get us into orange. That's a specific alert to probable danger. You're ready to take action, but you're still not fully committed. If the situation presents itself, we go to red or action mode. This situational awareness applies outside human-based threats. If we look at like a severe weather incident, a tornado watch would get us into orange. Okay, we're ready, but it's not a tornado warning. If the tornado warning happens, we go into red, and that's action mode. We're focused only on the tornado warning. You can see black. Black is system overload. That's panic. That's acute stress disorder. That is when we are not prepared for an emergency. We're not aware it could happen. It does happen, and we get total system overload, a total breakdown of physical and mental performance. We are not useful in an emergency if we're in white, and we're not useful if we're in black. But neither of those states are permanent. So if people find themselves in a situation where they're not aware or they're in a panic mode, provide training can help them get out of that so they understand what their roles are. One of the easiest solutions to get out of those mindsets is just simply take a breath. If you can imagine how that can calm people down. If we look at a basketball player, as he's running up and down the court, he's shooting, he gets fouled, he goes to the free throw line, we expect a lot of precision, a lot of stress, a lot of pressure. What's one of the first things they do to help calm themselves down? Breathe. New recruit in the Army, we want to teach them how to shoot. We get them on the range, they're nervous, they've been yelled at. How are we going to calm them down? Breathe. So great exercises to help people get out of those response modes that are not useful in an emergency. They are not permanent elements of a response. Next slide. So we talk about preparedness, and it really has been recently kind of refined. In 2011, Presidential Policy Directive went out that kind of refined what preparedness was. Now, for those that are familiar with emergency management, there have been 4 phases of emergency management for a while, and there still are. Prevention mitigation was one phase, then preparedness was its own phase, then response recovery. What they've sort of refined at FEMA now is saying, preparedness is more than just one thing. There's 5 elements of preparedness, and that's prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. So when we're preparing for any specific event, whether it's a human-based threat, severe weather, earthquake, we want to look at all these elements: prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. That's what helps get us to be prepared. And next slide. So prevention, the actions taken to decrease the likelihood an event or a crisis will occur. You cannot prevent what you do not see coming. So if you're not aware of your hazards, and you can go on next slide, please. If we're not aware of our potential hazards, we're not going to be able to prevent it. So the key thing in prevention and all hazard preparedness is an area hazards assessment. Working with your emergency management professionals, understanding what your risks are. When we look at human-based threats, the way that we break it down, now the FBI will tell you there are 4 categories of workplace violence, and an active shooter or violent intruder is workplace violence. I don't disagree with the FBI's strategy there, but what we look at is breaking it down into 2 categories, insider or outsider. Since we used Columbine earlier as an example, if I say Columbine and I say Sandy Hook, you think school shooter, but there's totally different prevention strategies. Columbine was an insider attack. We listed out all those pre-attack indicators that those students demonstrated and should have been observed. Sandy Hook was an outsider attack. That killer had nothing to do with the Sandy Hook school system, different prevention strategy. So when we look at prevention for a human-based threat, we have to look at the insider, where we're looking at behavioral assessment, and the outsider, which is more physical security, law enforcement, target hardening. Next slide. For the insider threat, whether it's school targeted violence or workplace violence, employee that's affiliated with it, a good way to understand what makes an insider dangerous, or anyone dangerous, but defining dangerous for that insider threat is an acronym or a system that was developed by Gavin Demecker. His book, The Gift of Fear, is really a great resource for anybody that's responsible for the safety of others, and also if you want to learn more about just safeguarding yourself. It's called The Gift of Fear. In this book, he outlines what makes someone dangerous. He describes that with the acronym of JACA, or as we see spelled out here, justification, alternatives, consequences, and ability. And what Demecker says, and it really makes sense, in order for someone to be dangerous, we need to look at how they view the world. Does that person do they feel justified in violence? If they do, that makes them more likely to act out. If we don't feel justified in violent behavior, we're not going to become violent. We're going to seek other resources, whether it's through the legal system, filing a complaint. We're not going to just act out violently. Does the person, not do we, but does the person perceive alternatives to violence? If they don't see alternatives, that's a concern. Consequences is the next step. If the person does not see the consequences or care about the consequences of violence, that makes them more dangerous. If there's a common factor in human threats as far as mass killers, it is that they do not have an exit strategy. They expect to die or to be killed or be at least captured during their attack. So the consequences of carrying out an attack are not important to them. They accept they're going to die. We look at, Sandy Hook, killing those people was more important to Adam Lanza than his own life. We look at the Aurora Theater in Colorado, where that trial is going on now. While he did not commit suicide or attempt or seek out suicide by cop, he did not resist. He did not care about the consequences. He accepted that. The last element of JACA is the ability. Does the person have the ability to carry out the threat? What Demecker says, if one of these elements is present, it's probably a transient issue. It's probably just they said something inappropriate. Doesn't mean we don't look into it, but it's not a concern. If 2 are present, it's a serious concern, and if 3 or more are present, it's an imminent concern. We need to act immediately. So this JACA concept is something that everybody that does what we call high-stakes predictions should be familiar with. By high-stakes predictions, we mean employee termination, dealing with employees that are, maybe having domestic violence issues at home, and I don't say that's the employee that's concerned, but your facility then observes their risk. Maybe they filed a restraining order. Now that significant other is going to seek out to find them at your place of work. So understanding if that significant other is exhibiting these warning signs. So if you're making high-stakes predictions, or one of your employees are, understanding this concept of JACA, that is a snapshot. It's not a full threat assessment, but it's that snapshot to say, yeah, we really need to get some professionals in here. So defining dangerousness is a critical aspect of preparedness. Next. Another aspect of prevention or preparedness and understanding if someone is dangerous is your intuition. Your intuition is always right for 2 reasons. It's always in response to something, and it always acts in your best interest. So I'm not suggesting that every time you have an intuitive feeling that that's going to come out to be factual, but the intuition process itself wasn't flawed. Now, if it wasn't factual, what you've done is learned a new way to distinguish better, and your intuition will improve. So I'm not suggesting we always rely only on tuition, but it's at least worth exploring because it's trying to act in your best interest, and it's also in response to something that you've observed at some level. We're the only creatures on Earth that will override our intuition. If you imagine an animal in the wild at a watering hole, if it gets scared or it senses something, it runs away. It doesn't try to convince itself that, it's not going to be that type of deer. I'm not going to live in fear. It at least analyzes it. So don't override your intuition. And intuition can come in a lot of different ways. You can see the messengers of intuition. But sometimes people will make dark humor or jokes because they just don't want to come out and say, hey, Brad's acting really weird and he was in the lunchroom. It's kind of creeping me out. So instead, we'll make a joke about, well, I hope Brad's not the one that's going to go postal to see if anybody else feels the same way. So as a leader in your facility, listen to people's intuition. It doesn't mean we're going to overreact on it, but we're at least going to acknowledge it and use that as an opportunity to explore, to look for more information. Next slide. When we talk about behaviors that will allow us to identify, especially when we look at intuition, things that will allow our intuition to fire off on. One of the systems that I came up with, we call it first-timer syndrome. And basically what that is physical and behavioral indicators that are exhibited immediately prior to an attack or if someone is building up to an attack. These mass killers, while they do not expect to survive an attack, it's the first time they've done it. So they're going to be showing warning signs. If they're in the planning process, this is a new area for them. So even though they've resigned themselves that they don't care if they survive, it doesn't mean they're proficient at it and there won't be leakage or things that can be observed. So when we look at, the situational awareness component of that, why we need to be in yellow. We need to be aware of our environment so that if someone is showing these warning signs, we can act. When we look at whether or not we act, the loop that you see below the color codes is a system that was developed by an Air Force fighter pilot named John Boyd. It's called the Boyd cycle or the OODA loop. And OODA is the acronym for observe, orient, decide, and act. That OODA process is how we make decisions under an emergency, even if we really don't know that that's what we're doing. In order to make a decision, we first have to observe the need to make a decision, whether it's a gunshot, whether it's a bad storm coming in or an intercom announcement, or we observe a vehicle that's parked in an appropriate place. We have to observe something before we can start the decision-making process. The better your situational awareness, the more likely you are to observe it. Then you orient yourself to your options. Being familiar with your environment helps you to orient faster. So that's the next phase. Then we decide. Based on our training, the better we understand our options, the better we're going to decide. And then, to the best of our ability, we act. And if the situation changes, we repeat the loop. So that situational awareness ties into a lot of different areas, especially with trying to identify first-timer syndrome. The importance of situational awareness in your facility cannot be overstated. If a shooter had to come to your facility today, we can't stop them from coming, but we can determine when we know they're there. When would you want to know? When they're in the parking lot or at the front door? Well, obviously the parking lot. The front door or the reception area? Front door, reception area, or offices. Sooner we can recognize the threat, the more options we have. So situational awareness, that observe, is the first step before we can make a decision in our plans. Next slide. This illustrates just some possible pre-attack indicators. These are very short-term, immediately prior to the attack. These are not necessarily the longer workplace violence behavioral issues, but you can see that these, as you look through them, and I'm not going to read each one, these occur hundreds of times a day. It's your intuition and your awareness that helps you to determine when it really matters. It's your ability, your intuition to tie in why it's inappropriate that they're wearing the clothes that they wear, or their facial expressions, or how they're turning their body, and how they're interacting or not interacting with others. On the governor's detail, a term that I used for this is JDLR. Just don't look right. What we wanted to do was try to hone in on that. We wanted to hone on, well, why don't they look right? What behaviors are they indicating that we can put into fact and put into training so they're observable for other people? Doesn't mean we're going to overreact when we see these things. We're going to rely on our training and our intuition and our experience to say, you know what, this is just a person that's passing through. They're not a concern, or this person poses a threat. And the next slide. These show some others, and the first one up there, I'll let you read through them, looks at the door-to-door distance. I mentioned the parking lot as an example. If a shooter had to come to your facility today, when would you want to know, parking lot or front door? Well, active killers will typically try to minimize door-to-door distance. Not at all suggesting just because someone parks in your fire lane that poses a threat. We know it happens thousands of times a day, and nothing bad ever happens. but if you are so numb to looking to see that person that parked in your fire zone that you lack that situational awareness, you don't see the difference between someone getting a briefcase out to run it in and drop off paperwork versus getting a rifle out of the back seat. The Sandy Hook example, the killer that day parked in the fire zone, the fire lane outside of Sandy Hook Elementary School, and got in the back and pulled out a rifle. If we can recognize that, it gives more time to respond. So that situational awareness piece comes in. So you can kind of see through there. So the situational awareness piece ties in with being able to identify when someone is potentially violent. Next slide. Protection, we looked at prevention there. Protection is the next step in preparedness. And all of these elements are interdependent. So when we talk about when the actual emergency plan gets written, that's something that we specialize in emergency planning. The emergency plan touches on each of these elements. They are all interdependent, and the planning process is an element of each of these phases. When we look at protection, it's the means, capabilities, secure against active violence. Protection focuses on ongoing actions that protect people and property from a threat or hazards. Next slide. So when we look at outsider threats, I mentioned before in human-based threats, we kind of break them down into outsider and outsider. Outsider threats, the behavioral analysis really isn't viable to your facility because you're probably not going to know who they are that they pose a threat. The outsiders, we're relying upon the physical security. When we look at physical security, it's important that your facility leader understand the role of physical security. A layered approach, the layered concept, the ability to deter unwanted behavior, the ability to detect unwanted behavior, delay access in your facility, and respond. Those four elements are really what make up physical security. Deter, detect, delay, and respond. So physical security plays a role in that. So perhaps you are locking your doors and have good access control. That is great, but take some time to look at your facility and think, does our access control really keep someone that is committed from getting in? We go back to Sandy Hook. Locked front door, it was right next to a glass window, and the door itself was glass. The killer just shot out the window. So your facility might have reasonable access control, but if it is surrounded by glass, realize that if someone is committed to getting into your facility with the intent of taking lives, they do not have an exit strategy, so the consequences don't matter to them, then your access control isn't perhaps as strong as you thought. Now, there's strategies you can look at to reinforce that, but it's also a training issue. So your staff understand what might be required of them when they respond, and we'll get to response in just a little bit. Next slide. Mitigation is another element of preparedness. So mitigation is the capability necessary to eliminate or reduce the loss of life and property or damage by lessening the impact of an event or emergency. So again, these are all interdependent, interconnected. Go to the next slide. We look at mitigation strategies. This is a card that we put together. It's yellow because we want situational awareness. Yellow is prepared, alert, relaxed, good situational awareness. Run, hide, fight are mitigation strategies. Now, they're an element of response, but really run, hide, fight, we don't pretend that when we look at active shooter response that run, hide, fight can save everyone's life. Prevention has failed. We're now trying to minimize the loss of life. So it's really an element of mitigation. So when we look at the prevention and protection aspects failing and we have to do something, run, hide, fight are our options. And that's what Department of Homeland Security recommends for everyone in the U.S., whether you're in a K-12 school. It's in the 2013 Guide for High Quality Emergency Plans put out by FEMA and the U.S. Department of Ed. It's in the Guide for Higher Education. It's in the Guide for Workplace. It's in the Guide for Retail. Run, hide, fight are your best options. The way we present that is you run when you have direct contact or you can't secure your area or you have a clear path of escape. Running is just avoiding contact. Get to a safer area. Hide only when you have indirect contact and you're able to secure your area. It's hide and seek with no rules. It's not just creating passive targets hiding under a desk. You only deny access. Fight is the last resort where we fight if we have direct contact and we cannot run and we have a risk to life. So fight is that worst case scenario for mitigation. Next slide. Response, I'm going to read this quote just because I think it's really important when we look at the 9/11 Commission report. Emergency response is a product of preparedness. On the morning of September 11, 2001, the last best hope for the community of people working in or visiting the World Trade Center rested not with national policymakers, but with private firms and local public service, especially the fire, police, and emergency medical service and building safety professionals. You know, the response is the people coming in. Now, there will be coordinated response, your facility response, and then also public safety and first responders coming in to assist. Next. So something that your facility should be looking at in your plans is the incident command system. ICS has been around for over 30 years now. It is a leadership strategy that lends itself well to an emergency because it's going to help you minimize your span of control. No one person can do everything. It's going to help you delegate authority, and it's going to focus on the priorities. And the first priority is always to save lives. But ICS does not just occur naturally in an emergency situation. It takes plans, and it takes training, and it takes practice. The other thing you need to understand about ICS, your public safety partners are using the incident command system. So that transfer of command is very important. You very well might be a facility executive and a facility leader, but when the fire department arrives, we want to transfer command to them. That doesn't mean you no longer have a role. So understanding that transition is critically important. So utilizing the incident command system and understanding how public safety are using it is very important. Next slide. So objectives when we look at an active shooter, things that we want to do when we talk about the incident command system is managing by objectives. What are our goals? Well, first we want to try to protect people by limiting the shooter's access to them. That's not always a lockdown. A lockdown only does not help people if they have direct contact. If the shooter's in the same room or area as you, it doesn't help you. And it also doesn't help people that are in areas that cannot be secured. Emergency plans should address people that are at the highest risk first. The people at the highest risk in an active shooter are those that have direct contact, and those are areas that can't be protected. So that's why run, hide, fight is a much better system than trying to just use the lockdown. We obviously want to notify 911, and then we want to assist people requiring help. So that's what objectives would look like in an emergency plan. Now, your facility objectives would also tie in. Once these are accomplished, it doesn't mean that business functions can't be addressed. Securing cash drawers, minimizing hazardous materials, transferring business operations. All those things are reasonable, but first we want to save lives. Next slide. Responsibilities of staff, I'll kind of let you look through these, but you want to look at it. Each facility is going to be unique, but your planning process and response should identify who's responsible for what, and then the other thing you have an obligation to do is provide the training. One of the things that our planning system has developed is the ability to link our online training courses for responsibilities with their assignments when the plan is developed. We want to make sure staff are trained. It's one thing to say, hey, I'm going to look at my resources and say this person is most effective to respond to this type of situation. But what we want to do also is make sure that person knows, make sure that person is trained. Next slide. I mentioned the decision-making process earlier, the Boyd cycle or the OODA loop under situational awareness. So once again, no plan can cover every possible scenario in an emergency. At some point, people have to make decisions. The decision-making process under stress can be very difficult. So this training people in this process, helping them understand the observe, situational awareness, orient, understand your environment. Runner on first, one out, ball comes to me. What am I supposed to do with it? It's understanding your environment. It helps you orient faster. It's an operational environment analysis. It's just, here's my place of work, here's my responsibilities. Decide. Telling them what their responsibilities are and training them in the responsibilities help them decide faster, and then act as their ability to implement it as best they can under the conditions. If the situation changes, change the loop. We do not want linear thinkers in an emergency. Next slide. Key decision-making factors in the human-based stat, when we talk about the OODA loop, contact plus location equals response. That's the combat calculus. Your level of contact is either direct or it's indirect. We can't have a plan ahead of time to say this is what we're going to do. It depends on where the bad guy is and where we are. So determine your level of contact. Location is your ability to secure it, your ability to evacuate, and then also, and I don't have it up on that slide, is your responsibility. If you have students with special needs, staff with special needs, if you're in a hospital environment and you're responsible for caring for people. So under location, we really emphasize the need to understand your responsibilities and how that ties into your options. Next slide. Recovery is the final phase when we talk about the elements of preparedness. The means and capabilities necessary to assist and return to normal operations. Normal operations is a very broad statement there. So normal operations from a business standpoint, business resumption. It's also normal operations from a human standpoint, your mental health resources. So recovery is business continuity. It's also coordinating with crisis intervention, mental health professionals to make sure that that the human mind can get back to normal, not just the workplace. Next slide. So recovery considerations, obviously mental health, business continuity, your business continuity planning. That's, again, where we have some software tools and have done some work in that, but understand your business functions. So we have to do that analysis to say what resources are required to achieve our objectives. So it's people, it's the places, the facility, equipment, services to include support services, and then also the funding stream. So business continuity is really a planning process all its own that should be coordinated with your emergency planning. Mental health is looking for resources to make sure you got the agreements in place to provide mental health support when it's desperately needed. Next slide. So the last thing I'm going to leave you with here is, really need to do something. This quote, the head of the Federal Aviation Administration announced today his agency would soon propose a rule requiring airlines to place bulletproof shields around pilots to protect them. Until now, the airlines have followed the wishes of hijackers to provide maximum assurances no one would get hurt. It's probably not surprising that's from the New York Times article, but next slide. It might surprise you to know that article that it's referencing was actually written in 1970. It was written in 1970. We can go on to the next slide, please. When John DeVivo went onto the plane. Now you can see a whole list of other incidents that occurred where someone gained access to a cockpit. Point being that 1970 article was the best of intentions, but no one did something. So hopefully some of the strategies that I've talked about and Amy is getting ready to talk about can help you prepare. But really we understand it's as a facility leader, the responsibility is on you to do something to help implement these emergency plan changes. Next slide. So with that, I will pass it over, and I will certainly be around to answer any questions. Thank you.
Brad's insight and the thanks, Brad. We really appreciate your insight and all the information that you've provided us with. From an informational standpoint and from a best practices standpoint, we've just heard a lot about preparedness, and hopefully everyone has learned something today that they can go back and implement in their organization. That's our goal, to give some actionable results to you all today and during our session. I want to spend the next couple of minutes here talking about response, and then we'll be able to open the lines up for questions here in a moment. Can we move to the next slide, please? I want to talk a little bit about, Brad has mentioned situational awareness and provided some good examples for us, but I want people to understand that from a situational awareness perspective, having the information and knowledge you need in order to be able to react and to respond to a situation is really what we're talking about. And that situation can be as routine as the air conditioning going out, or a leak in the bathroom, or something as severe as a fire, or an extreme and as rare as an armed intruder, as Brad just walked us through some scenarios. But regardless of that situation, we want the people in your building and on your campus, and as well as across your entire organization, to be aware of what's going on and when it's going on. We all know that we all have personalized environments in which we live and work. And so that means each situation is different. Each requires a different set of situational awareness. And as Brad described to us, situational awareness can help us be proactive and oftentimes preventative. But in the case where we are not able to prevent something from happening, we have the chance of mitigating it. We have to be able to respond to those unfolding events. Even the smallest observations can mitigate risk. So being aware of your surroundings is critical, as I said before. At Status Solutions, we help organizations like yours protect against loss of life, property, business, and overall convenience. The framework of our software-based solutions allow people to read what's going on, hear about the information, see what's going on, and be able to act and respond to it. Brad calls it the operational environment analysis or assessment, a way of leveraging reporting and events to be able to analyze after the fact what happened, why did it happen, and how can we better prepare in the future. We all live in a digital society and in a mobile society, so we want to be able to have this information available to us in the way in which we work and live, and that's through screens and devices. And so we want to be able to populate that information so that we have it when we need it. Because of this, we've all become very visual. So we want to be able to see what's going on. As I said, to receive an alert, whether it's to your desktop PC or to your smartphone, or to be able to read that alert and even hear or see it, could be critical as an event unfolds. I want everybody to take a moment and think about how the strategies that we discussed today can impact your environment. All of our businesses are different. We've got some schools on the line today, manufacturing facilities, retail stores, senior living communities, and hospitals. It runs the gamut. But we want you to be able to look at these scenarios, go back to your teams and discuss what applies to you. Do you have a strategy? Do you have a plan? Are you prepared to train and empower your staff? And are you equipping them with the technology that they need to be able to respond in an event? Safe Plans and Status Solutions are both organizations that were created to help. So I hope we were able to get that process started for you today. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you both, Brad and Amy, for that information presentations. We will now open up the floor to the Q&A, and Brad and Amy will address as many questions as we can in our remaining time. So first, I'd like to start off with a question about the pre-attack indicator concept that you had mentioned, Brad. In terms of, you had talked about some pre-attack indicators or pain for active shooter, intruder. What about, or could you talk on any possible indicators for other types of events, maybe a natural disaster or a gas explosion line? Are there any other type of pre-attack indicators, in other scenarios that you might point out?
Sure, absolutely. Absolutely. On this, because of the time we had, we wanted to try to, rather than go all over the board for every possible hazard, we wanted to try to narrow in on some, so there might be some takeaways. But the concepts can be applied to all hazards preparedness. We might not call it an attack, we might call it a pre-incident indicator, but for severe weather, obviously the weather monitoring. The hazardous material, depending on your facility, you might have those types of resources to help monitor it. But even if your facility is not involved in the manufacture of hazardous material, but just geographically proximate to places that are, that awareness is the first step. And then engaging your local public safety and your first responders to say, hey, how would I know if there was a gas leak here, or what would be the warning process? Possibly engaging in discussions with the manufacturer or the pipeline to see, we've got a facility here that we don't think we could evacuate if your pipeline ruptured in time. What can we get into place to help us get maximum notice? So measures that you can take, but absolutely. So when you look at your area hazards analysis as part of an all hazards plan, take that preparedness step and say, okay, what can help us with warning time? What can maximize it? With weather, we've got great forecasting. Earthquakes, it's not there yet, but just understanding that while many earthquakes occur that do not follow along a known fault line, those are typically less than 6.0 on the Richter scale. So when we look at the more devastating quakes, they occur along known fault lines. So understanding that's a potential hazard, so that while you might not know about the pre-incident, you've taken those warning steps to, well, we can't prevent it, to at least mitigate. But that's a great point. That concept can be applied across the spectrum of emergencies.
Thank you. Thanks, Brad. And next, communication seems to be a theme across both of your presentations in terms of having not only the facilities directors knowing what to do and their colleagues, but then the occupants, of course, and maybe, I guess, even first responders. So in terms of communication and response with that in mind, I would like to ask, what are some tried and true strategies or tips that you might provide in terms of communicating and making an effective communications plan, and then obviously, being able to bring technologies to boost that. What are some, maybe each of you can give maybe a few points on communication and really how to keep your occupants, aware of what's going on when something does happen?
Sure. What I suggest is, as part of that planning process, is we've identified, resources that can help us to communicate in our response. you know, that's where we look at what we have, and that's the opportunity to go in and look for solutions. And, you know, I'll allow Amy to talk on it, but you know, like Status Solutions provides to say, you know, what technology resources can we identify now that help us communicate more effectively? Because obviously there's a great number of tools out there that can help us respond. So look at those solutions while you're in the planning process, not try to play catch up during the emergency.
I agree, and I think what's most important here is as you're looking at your environment and assessing your infrastructure and what you have, you absolutely need to be able to leverage what works from a business operations perspective. And so in terms of communicating, just think about, you know, what your employees are using to communicate just on a day-to-day basis, whether it is, you know, their landline telephones, their PCs, smartphones, pagers, handheld two-way radios, PA systems. How are you communicating just regular business operations information? And then being able to leverage that to communicate from an emergency perspective as well. So we don't want to, we want to be able to take a technology and adapt or improve the processes, not necessarily change, you know, the way that you do business. We want to enhance it. And so absolutely being able to leverage, you know, your communication structure and what some of the best practices that you already have in place, but just to implement an emergency strategy into that as well.
You know, just to kind of expand on that, when we look at any type of an emergency, you know, the hazardous material release, the ability to use technology to effectively communicate to everybody so that the stakeholders, you know, the family members, the support people, not just the folks on site, but those people affected, hey, we're experiencing this, and communicating with them ahead using some deterrence media strategies ahead of time so they understand we do have a plan, we have a process, so that when the actual emergency happens, you're not just in crisis communications mode, you're just reinforcing messages you've sent out before. The hurricane, you know, when we get advance notice, the ability to send out those notifications early so that it's a less of an impact when the actual event happens. So really look at communications as a great tool during your planning process, and then of course you need to practice it and test it. Don't just wait for the emergency to see if everything works.
Great. And Amy, this might be a question best suited for you. What kind of, if someone is looking to implement technology to improve situational awareness and obviously for safety and security as a goal, can you talk a little bit about what kinds of networks or what kind of you know, infrastructure do these situational awareness technologies work on?
Absolutely. Absolutely, and I think what's most important here in terms of understanding, you know, the infrastructure and the requirements is that, you know, different applications need to run on different networks. And when you're talking about life safety and specifically mobile duress, in the event of emergency, that someone needs to call for help, whatever type of help that is, that needs to be on a secured network and an environment. You know, best practices is from a RF perspective. But then you've got other communication means that you can, you know, leverage Wi-Fi, you can leverage a cellular environment. Regardless, it really comes down to the organization, the type of facility, whether it's a wide area campus, single buildings, multiple buildings, and what it really is you're trying to do and accomplish from an application perspective. So it's not, you know, it's not a short answer. It's part of an overall discovery process and working on a plan and understanding the environment. But there are definitely networks that can be leveraged or implemented that will support, you know, the different types of applications that situational awareness brings to your organization.
Okay. And also, is there a way that, can you give some advice, either of you, on ways to improve facilities directors and their colleagues can improve their relationship with the local police department or other traditional first responders, whether in a traditional sense or with this type of technology implemented? How do they involve them to maximize results?
Sure, there's a couple of different ways. One, typically more and more Homeland Security regional groups, typically they're called RSOCs, they're committees that are regional, are embracing public-private partnerships. So depending on the nature of your facility, you might already be a public entity and you've got an even easier inroad. But for the private facilities, they're understanding the need to embrace that. A lot of times law enforcement's looking for training opportunities, even if it's just walkthrough. It doesn't have to be, totally disruptive to your business. It can be done in off hours or on weekends, so they're looking for that. Engage them. Reach out to your local emergency management coordinator. Ask what processes are in place and how you can become more involved. There's a cliche in emergency management that business cards shouldn't be exchanged during the emergency. So that's what you want to try to get, is understand who's out there and see what your local county has in place. The odds are that there's something in place that you can start networking into, and they can help you, increase your preparedness and facilitate those introductions.
Thank you. And also, you had mentioned, Brad, the layered approach to physical security, and I did want to touch on that in terms of gaps in physical. Are there gaps in physical security that you can comment on that you've maybe seen in different types of facilities that maybe commonly, common mistakes, quote unquote, that facilities people are making?
Sure, that's kind of unique to the facility. I'll tell you, just about every facility has gaps. The greatest concern to me a facility leader should have is not that the gaps are there, it's that they understand what their gaps are. Understand your vulnerabilities. It doesn't mean you have an unsafe workplace. Just understand them so you're able to respond faster. So depending on, basically your earlier question touches on that first layer. The first layer really is your community. It's not just your border fence and your perimeter, it's your community. So establishing those relationships so that you've got good lines of communication, looking at your perimeter, where it's at. If you're in a multi-tenant building to where you're not the sole occupant, understand the risk factors that might be associated with other tenants, how that can impact your facility, access control into your site. Look at the vulnerabilities there. A locked door is good, but if there's glass around that, understand that someone that's committed might get in, and if you're dependent upon someone right by that locked door with glass to notify you of concerns, then that's going to be a failure point, because that person is going to need to take action to save their own life and not be able to notify other people. So physical securities typically identify these vulnerabilities with a security vulnerabilities assessment. So that should provide some strategies to your facility on how to improve. But just as importantly, here's your weak points, just so we can train around it and how we would respond if those weak points are taken advantage of.
Thank you. Okay, and then Amy, actually, you had mentioned mobile duress, and we are hearing more about that and have some interest in that. So especially for schools, mobile duress being an issue. Can you expand on what that is and how it works?
Absolutely. When talking about situational awareness, we kind of look at it as the first application. And a lot of times for facilities, it's kind of their entry point. And specifically in K-12, being able to call for help, and whether you are, a teacher in a classroom with, a student with allergies, whether you are, out on the playground and somewhere where someone were to get injured, whether you're in facilities and something happens in the cafeteria or in the kitchen, and as extreme as an intruder or an active shooter situation, having the ability to call for help when you need help is really what mobile duress is. And the technology allows you to, carry a device or panic button, help button, on your person that allows you to call for help. And associating some kind of an escalation path with that, and some kind of logic behind what kind of event it is, what do I need help, why do I need help, and then making sure that those individuals get help. And so schools throughout the country obviously are paying attention to this and are implementing it, looking at strategies. It's not just a K-12 issue. It's colleges and universities, manufacturing facilities, hotels. Think about lone worker applications as well in retail environments and in hotels. So there are lots of different applications. Really, mobile duress just comes down to if you've got an individual that needs to call for help, how do they do that in the most effective manner to be able to get response?
Thank you. And also, Amy, on that idea of on that idea, how easy is it to integrate this type of system into existing alarm systems, into existing infrastructure? Is it possible do those link up together?
Absolutely. From an integration perspective, it goes back to looking at, facilities have fire panels. Facilities have egress and ingress systems already in place. They have communication systems, as we talked about before. And so being able to plug in an alert server concept, something that's going to sit in the middle that is then going to bring information in and pump alerts out. So absolutely, that's something that is easy to do from an integration perspective. It's just really goes back to the discovery and understanding the environment and what you're trying to accomplish. But, the issue or the challenge that a lot of organizations have is they have a lot of systems in place, a lot of alarming systems in place. And being able to turn those, disparate alarms into kind of an integrated alerting strategy or approach is something that, we help customers do every day.
Great. Thank you, Amy. Okay, so it looks like we are out of time. I'd like to thank all our attendees for joining us today, and of course, Brad and Amy for your presentation and insights, and to Status Solutions for sponsoring the webinar. Thank you, everyone.